The name Marco Rossi carried weight in places where most men never dared to step. In the quiet back rooms of restaurants where deals were whispered over glasses of red wine, and construction offices where signatures on contracts meant millions, and in the darker corners of the city where power moved quietly, without newspapers ever printing a word. At 46 years old, Don Marco Rossi was not just wealthy. He was feared. People spoke his name carefully. Sometimes not at all. But inside the walls of the Rossi mansion, an estate of white stone and tall iron gates on the northern edge of the city, Marco was something very different. He was a father. 2 small boys had changed the course of his life in ways no rival family, no police investigation, and no business war ever could. Sebastian and Matteo Rossi were 4 years old. Identical twins with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and eyes so wide they seemed to absorb every detail of the world around them. They were the only people on earth who could make Marco Rossi kneel. Every night when he returned home, sometimes long after midnight, he would quietly step into their room. He would stand by the door and watch them sleep. Their small chests rising and falling. Their tiny fists curled around blankets decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. In those silent moments, the most powerful man in the room was not the feared Mafia boss. It was the father who would have traded every dollar he owned to keep those boys safe. But there was a truth about Marco Rossi that few people understood. For all the power he held in the outside world, he was almost a stranger inside his own home. The business that made him rich also stole something from him. Time. He left the mansion before the boys woke up most mornings. And on the nights when he returned late, the twins were already asleep. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was building a future for them. But childhood does not wait for business deals to finish. And in the quiet spaces Marco left behind, someone else filled them. Her name was Elena Morales. Elena was 32 years old, though the calm seriousness in her eyes often made her appear older. She had arrived at the Rossi mansion 2 years earlier with a small suitcase, a letter of recommendation from a family she once worked for, and the quiet determination of someone who understood that jobs like this could change a life, or end it. At first, Elena kept her head down. She cleaned the marble floors that reflected the chandeliers like mirrors. She polished silverware that cost more than most people earned in a month. And she cooked simple meals in a kitchen the size of a restaurant. But slowly, almost without anyone noticing, Elena became something more than a housekeeper. She became the center of the twins' world. She knew things no one else bothered to learn. She knew Sebastian hated the crust on his sandwiches. She knew Matteo woke up every night at exactly 2 in the morning, sitting upright in his bed until someone held him long enough for sleep to return. She knew the exact lullaby that made both boys stop crying within seconds. And she knew how to make them laugh so hard they would fall backward onto the living room rug. The boys trusted her with the blind faith only children possess. When they scraped their knees, they ran to Elena. When thunder shook the windows during storms, they climbed into Elena's lap. And when nightmares woke them in the dark, it was Elena's voice that soothed them back to sleep. Not their fathers. Not their mothers. Just Elena. Which brought us to Isabella Rossi. If Elena was quiet and steady, Isabella was something entirely different. She was the kind of woman who turned heads the moment she entered a room. At 38, Isabella carried herself with the effortless elegance of someone who had spent her entire life surrounded by luxury. Her dark hair always fell perfectly across one shoulder. Her dresses were tailored to perfection. Her smile, when she chose to use it, could charm an entire table of powerful men into agreement. But beneath that beauty lived something colder. Isabella Rossi did not like chaos. She did not like the violence that followed Marco's world. And she often told anyone willing to listen that she dreamed of something simpler. A normal life. A quiet house. Children who grew up far away from the shadows of organized crime. At least, that was what she said. But words have a way of hiding truths. And inside the Rossi mansion, there were moments, small moments, that suggested Isabella Rossi was not the person she pretended to be. Those moments did not stand out at first. Not to Marco. Not to the lawyers or business partners who visited the house. But Elena noticed them. Because Elena noticed everything. She noticed the way Isabella sometimes waited until the house fell completely silent before walking down the hallway toward Marco's private office. She noticed the faint glow of the office computer screen long after midnight. And once, while bringing a tray of tea upstairs, Elena heard Isabella speaking on the phone in a voice so low it sounded like someone whispering secrets into the dark. Elena had paused outside the door. Just for a second. Just long enough to realize Isabella was not speaking to any friend or family member. She was discussing numbers. Large numbers. Accounts. Transfers. Elena had walked away quickly after that. Because in houses like this, curiosity could become dangerous. Still, the strange moments continued. Papers moved from Marco's office desk to different drawers. Folders disappeared entirely. And every few weeks, a courier arrived carrying thick manila envelopes addressed only to Mrs. Rossi. Isabella always signed for them personally. Then disappeared upstairs with them. No one else was allowed to touch them. Elena tried to ignore it all. She reminded herself that she was only the housekeeper. Her job was to care for the children, clean the house, and keep quiet. Nothing more. But the morning the police cars arrived, everything changed. Because when federal agents stormed the Rossi mansion and arrested Marco Rossi on charges of money laundering, illegal weapons trafficking, and transferring $20 million to offshore accounts, the evidence they presented came directly from Marco's own computer. From his private bank accounts. From secure networks that only someone inside the house could access. And as the officers placed the handcuffs around Marco's wrists, Elena felt something deep inside her chest begin to twist. Because she had seen enough small, strange things over the past year to know one simple truth. Something inside this house was terribly wrong. And as the police cars carried Marco Rossi away toward federal detention, Elena Morales stood in the doorway holding the twins in her arms, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway. A single thought echoing through her mind. What if the man they just arrested was not the real criminal at all? The concrete walls do not care about reputation. The metal doors do not open faster because someone once controlled half the city's construction contracts. And the guards certainly do not speak softer because the man in the cell once had people who would do anything he asked. For the first time in decades, Marco Rossi was completely powerless. The small room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old steel. A single light buzzed above his head. Across the narrow table sat the only man who still spoke to him like the world outside had not already decided his fate. Daniel Carver. Marco's attorney for nearly 10 years. Daniel opened a thick folder filled with printed bank records, digital transfer logs, and federal reports. The evidence was overwhelming. At least on the surface. They're saying 20 million, Daniel said quietly, flipping through the pages. Transferred through 6 offshore accounts over the last year. Marco leaned back in the metal chair, the chains around his wrists clinking softly. I never authorized any of it, he said. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He kept reading. Line after line of transactions. Dates. Times. Authorization codes. All connected to Marco Rossi's personal network. But something about the timeline bothered him. Daniel stopped turning the pages. Where were you on March 12th? He asked. Marco frowned. Chicago. No, Daniel said, tapping the document. According to these logs, a transfer of $4 million was made from your office computer that night at 2:43 a.m. Marco shook his head slowly. Impossible. I was in Milan that week. Daniel flipped to another record. April 2nd. Another transfer. 3 million. Marco leaned forward. Tokyo. Business trip. Another page. Another transfer. June 18th, Daniel said. Marco exhaled slowly. Dubai. The lawyer closed the folder. For the first time since the arrest, something inside the case shifted. Because the evidence showed Marco Rossi committing financial crimes inside his office, while airline records proved he had been on entirely different continents. Which meant one thing. Someone had used his access. Someone inside his world. Back at the Rossi mansion, the silence felt unnatural. The house was still immaculate. The marble floors still reflected the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. The fountain outside still whispered water across polished stone. But something inside the home had changed. Without Marco, the mansion felt hollow. And Elena Morales could feel it. The twins asked about their father every morning. "Where's Papa?" Sebastian asked once while Elena tied his shoes. Elena forced a small smile. "He's working," she said gently. The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. Because even she did not know if Marco Rossi would ever come back. But Elena had begun noticing things again. Small things. The kind most people ignored. While cleaning Marco's office one afternoon, she opened the wastebin beside his desk. Inside were thin strips of paper. Shredded. But not by a machine. By hand. Elena hesitated before touching them. Something about the pieces felt deliberate. As if someone had destroyed the document quickly. She carried the strips to the kitchen table later that night after the twins were asleep. One by one, she placed them together. It took nearly an hour. But slowly, parts of the message became visible. Account numbers. Transfer instructions. A handwritten note in the margin. Send before Friday. Elena felt her stomach tighten. She folded the pieces carefully and placed them inside a small wooden box hidden beneath her mattress. That was the first item. The second appeared 3 days later. A printed email left on Marco's office printer. No sender name. Just a subject line. Confirmation received. Attached were numbers that matched the transfer amounts investigators were accusing Marco of sending. Elena read the page twice. Then folded it slowly. It went into the box. Over the following weeks, the collection grew. Receipts. Notes. Fragments of emails. All small pieces of something that did not yet make sense. But Elena trusted one instinct above all others. When many strange things happen in the same place, they are rarely accidents. Meanwhile, Isabella Rossi had changed. At first the change was subtle. She stopped eating breakfast with the twins. Then she stopped appearing at dinner entirely. Most days she stayed locked inside the master bedroom with the door closed. Her voice could sometimes be heard through the hallway. Soft. Careful. Speaking on the phone for hours. One night Elena walked past the room carrying laundry and heard Isabella say something that made her slow down. "No. Not yet," Isabella whispered. "We have to wait until the trial begins." Elena moved away quickly. Her heart beating faster than before. Because whatever Isabella was planning, it clearly had not ended with Marco's arrest. And then came the confrontation. It happened on a gray afternoon while rain tapped quietly against the kitchen windows. Elena was helping the twins build a tower of wooden blocks on the living room rug when Isabella appeared in the doorway. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. "Elena," she said. The maid stood immediately. "Yes, ma'am?" Isabella held a white envelope in her hand. "Your services are no longer required," she said calmly. For a moment the room felt completely still. The twins looked up from their blocks. Elena blinked once. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Isabella extended the envelope. "Your final payment." Sebastian stood up immediately. "No," he said, grabbing Elena's hand. Matteo followed, wrapping his arms around Elena's leg. Isabella's smile tightened. "This arrangement has become unnecessary," she continued. "The boys will be staying with me from now on." Elena's mind raced. Because she had seen enough in the past weeks to know something terrible might be unfolding. And leaving the twins alone in this house, with Isabella behaving the way she had been, felt wrong. Very wrong. "I'll leave," Elena said slowly. "But not today." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "The children need time," Elena said gently, kneeling beside them. "I can help transition things." For a moment Isabella simply stared at her. Then the elegant calm vanished from her face. Her voice turned cold. "You misunderstand your position," Isabella said quietly. She stepped closer. "If you're still in this house tomorrow, I will call the police." Elena felt the twins gripping her tighter. "And what would you tell them?" she asked carefully. Isabella's lips curved into a thin smile. "That my housekeeper stole from us," she said. The words hung in the air like a blade. "And in a case like that," Isabella added softly, "who do you think they'll believe?" The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Elena looked down at the twins clinging to her legs. Then back at Isabella. And for the first time since Marco Rossi's arrest, Elena realized something chilling. This wasn't just about money. Something far darker was hiding inside this house. And if she walked away now, no one would ever discover the truth. Outside, the long driveway lamps glowed softly against the rain-washed stone. The fountain in the courtyard whispered quietly into the darkness, and the tall cypress trees swayed in the wind that rolled down from the hills. Inside the house, however, nothing felt calm. Since Marco's arrest, the nights had become the hardest time for the twins. During the day, toys and cartoons could distract them. Elena could keep them busy with homework, stories, and small adventures around the garden. But night brought questions. And fear. On this particular night, Elena had just finished folding the twins' laundry in her small room at the end of the hallway when she heard it. A sharp cry. Then another. Sebastian. Followed by Matteo. The kind of crying that came from nightmares. Or from something deeper. Elena set the laundry aside and stepped into the hallway. But before she could reach their bedroom, another door opened. Isabella's. The twins' crying grew louder. Isabella walked down the hallway in a silk robe, her expression irritated rather than concerned. "What is it now?" she muttered under her breath. Inside the twins' bedroom, the lights were still off. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Sebastian sat upright in bed, tears streaking his cheeks. Matteo clung tightly to his blanket. "Papa!" Sebastian cried. "Where's Papa?" Isabella walked toward them, forcing a thin smile. "Your father is busy," she said sharply. "Now lie back down." But the boys didn't calm down. Instead, their panic seemed to grow. Matteo began shaking his head rapidly. "No, no," he whispered. Isabella sat beside the bed, clearly losing patience. "Enough," she said. "You're acting like babies." Sebastian's breathing grew faster. "I want Papa," he cried. Isabella reached for him. "Stop crying," she snapped. And that was when Elena quietly stepped into the doorway. She didn't say anything at first. But the twins saw her. And everything changed. Sebastian immediately jumped out of bed. Matteo followed. Both boys ran straight past Isabella. Straight into Elena's arms. They clung to her desperately. "It's okay," Elena whispered softly, kneeling down and wrapping her arms around them. "You're safe." But Sebastian was still crying hard. His voice broke as he looked up at her. And then he said something that froze the entire room. "Mama." The word echoed in the quiet bedroom. But he wasn't looking at Isabella. He was looking at Elena. For a moment, no one moved. Elena felt her chest tighten. She had cared for the boys for 2 years. Fed them. Read them bedtime stories. Stayed awake during fevers. But hearing that word, spoken with such desperate trust, felt overwhelming. Behind her, Isabella slowly stood up. The humiliation on her face was impossible to hide. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes hardened. "What did he just say?" she asked coldly. Neither boy responded. They only held onto Elena tighter. Sebastian buried his face against Elena's shoulder. "Don't go," he whispered. Isabella's voice turned icy. "That is enough," she said. She walked toward them. "The boys are confused," she continued. "You will put them back to bed and return to your room." Elena looked at her carefully. "They're scared," she said gently. "They need comfort." Isabella's eyes flashed with anger. "They need their mother," she replied sharply. The silence that followed was heavy. Because everyone in the room knew something Isabella refused to admit. The twins didn't trust her. Not anymore. Isabella turned abruptly and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she looked back at Elena. Her voice dropped to a quiet threat. "Tomorrow," she said, "you are leaving this house." Then she shut the door. Hard. Morning arrived cold and gray. The tension inside the mansion felt thicker than ever. Elena prepared breakfast quietly while the twins sat beside her at the kitchen island. They stayed close. Too close. As if afraid she might disappear. Isabella entered the kitchen precisely at 9 o'clock. She wore a perfectly tailored white suit, her hair pulled neatly into place. To anyone outside the house, she looked composed. Elegant. Controlled. But Elena could see the anger beneath the surface. Isabella placed a small leather folder on the counter. "We need to talk," she said. Elena nodded slowly. The twins immediately sensed the tension. "Go finish your breakfast," Elena whispered gently. Reluctantly, the boys carried their plates to the dining table. Isabella waited until they were out of earshot. Then she leaned slightly forward. "You had your warning," she said quietly. Elena said nothing. Isabella opened the leather folder. Inside were several printed documents. "These," she said, sliding them across the counter, "are police complaint forms." Elena glanced down. "For theft," Isabella continued. Her smile was thin and controlled. $5,000 missing from my personal account." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "That's not true," she said calmly. "Of course it isn't," Isabella replied. "But proving that could take months." She tapped the papers lightly. "And until then, you could spend time in jail." Elena looked up slowly. The message was clear. Leave quietly. Or be destroyed. "You have until tonight," Isabella finished. Then she closed the folder and walked out of the kitchen. That afternoon, a black sedan pulled into the circular driveway. Daniel Carver stepped out of the car. Marco's lawyer had not planned to visit the mansion personally. But the timeline discrepancies in the evidence were too significant to ignore. If someone had accessed Marco's accounts while he was abroad, then the answer had to be inside the house. Elena saw him from the kitchen window. Her heart began to race. For weeks she had debated whether to speak. Whether to stay silent. Whether the strange things she had noticed truly meant anything. But after Isabella's threat that morning, the decision became clear. She could no longer keep the truth to herself. Daniel entered the house and introduced himself politely. "I'm looking for Mrs. Rossi," he said. "She's not here," Elena replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you can help me." They sat across from each other at the long dining table. For several seconds Elena said nothing. Then she finally spoke. "Mr. Rossi didn't do it," she said quietly. Daniel studied her carefully. "You sound very certain." Elena took a slow breath. "Because I've seen things," she said. "What kind of things?" Elena hesitated. Then she stood. "Wait here," she said. A moment later she returned carrying a small wooden box. She placed it gently on the table. Inside were the pieces she had collected for months. Shredded documents. Printed emails. Receipts. Notes. Daniel's expression slowly changed as he examined them. "Where did you get all this?" he asked. "From the house," Elena said. "From Mr. Rossi's office." Daniel flipped through the documents quickly. The account numbers matched the federal investigation. But the handwriting on several notes did not belong to Marco Rossi. "There's more," Elena said quietly. Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been watching Mrs. Rossi for months." The lawyer leaned forward. "And?" Elena swallowed, because saying the words out loud felt dangerous. But she knew the truth had to come out now. "I think she framed him," Elena said. The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky again. Daniel slowly closed the wooden box. If Elena was right, then the entire case against Marco Rossi had just begun to collapse. But exposing the truth would require something far more dangerous than evidence. It would require proving that Isabella Rossi had orchestrated one of the most elaborate betrayals imaginable. Investigation breakthrough. Elena had been holding onto something for months, knowing that the moment she revealed it could change everything. She placed a plain, unmarked envelope on the lawyer's desk, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. Inside, meticulously organized, were financial transfer records, notes written in precise, cold handwriting, courier receipts, and even recordings of phone conversations that had been carefully preserved. As the lawyer sifted through each piece of evidence, the reality became impossible to ignore. Isabella Rossi was not the dutiful, elegant wife everyone believed her to be. She had been secretly collaborating with Marco's most dangerous rival crime family, the Marcelli Syndicate, orchestrating a scheme that would topple Marco from his position of power. Real plan revealed. The true scope of Isabella's betrayal slowly unfolded. Frame Marco for massive financial crimes, including money laundering and offshore transfers. Ensure his imprisonment by manipulating evidence and timing transactions while he was abroad. Seize control of the Rossi assets and gain leverage over his empire. Seamlessly transfer the Mafia operations and influence to his rival family, leaving Marco powerless. Each point on the list was meticulously documented, showing months of planning, hidden transactions, and a network of enablers that Isabella had cultivated. The mansion, the office, and even the children's routines had all been manipulated to ensure she could operate unnoticed. Final cliffhanger. But as the lawyer dug deeper into the envelope, Elena's voice tightened. "There's one thing I haven't given you yet," she said, almost whispering. "The most damning evidence, and it's not on paper." He looked up at her, heart racing. "What do you mean?" A small device slipped from the envelope. A voice recorder, slightly worn, but intact. Elena pressed play. The room filled with a chilling, unmistakable voice, Isabella's voice, plotting, laughing, and giving orders. Every word a nail in Marco's coffin, every sentence a revelation that would shock anyone who heard it. The lawyer froze. Elena swallowed hard. This was the piece that could prove everything, the final key to dismantling the lies. And yet, as they listened, a new, terrifying thought crept into Elena's mind: Isabella must not know this exists. If she finds out, there would be no turning back. The tension in the mansion, already thick and suffocating, felt heavier than ever. The silent walls seemed to close in. Danger lurked not just in the courtroom, but in every hallway, every room. And Elena knew that revealing the truth could put her life, and the twins' lives, in immediate jeopardy. The final act of betrayal, revenge, and justice was about to begin, but the stakes had never been higher. The question hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable: could the Rossi Empire survive the storm that was about to hit, or would everything Marco had built be lost forever? The federal courthouse was already crowded long before the hearing began. Journalists filled the front rows, their cameras resting on their laps like silent witnesses waiting for history to unfold. Federal agents stood along the walls with rigid expressions, and the quiet murmur of speculation drifted through the room like a low storm. Everyone believed they already knew how this story would end. Marco Rossi, the feared Mafia boss, would finally face justice. That was the narrative the public had accepted for weeks. And as the heavy courtroom doors opened, every head turned. Marco entered wearing a dark suit provided by the detention facility. His wrists were no longer chained, but the weight of the accusation still followed him like shadows. He looked older than before. Not weaker. Just worn. The months of investigation, isolation, and betrayal had carved quiet lines into his face. But his eyes remained steady. Across the courtroom, Isabella Rossi sat beside her legal team. Elegant as ever. Poised. Untouchable. Her expression carried the same calm confidence she had worn since the day of Marco's arrest. To the outside world, she was the loyal wife attending her husband's trial. But Elena Morales knew the truth. She sat quietly in the back row, her hands clasped tightly together. This moment would decide everything. If the evidence worked, Marco would walk free. If it failed, the twins would grow up believing their father was a criminal. The judge entered the courtroom. All rise. The room stood. Then silence fell. The prosecutor began first, presenting the same case the public had already heard on the news. Bank transfers. Offshore accounts. Weapons shipments. Each piece of evidence painted the same picture. Marco Rossi, the architect of an international criminal operation. The prosecutor finished with confidence. The evidence clearly demonstrates a calculated financial operation directed by the defendant, he concluded. Then he sat down. All eyes turned to the defense table. Daniel Carver rose slowly. Marco's lawyer adjusted his glasses and walked toward the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, he began calmly, the prosecution's case appears convincing at first glance. He paused. But only if you ignore one critical fact. The room leaned forward slightly. Daniel picked up a folder from the table. Many of these transactions, he continued, occurred while Mr. Rossi was physically outside the country. He placed flight records onto the evidence screen. Chicago. Milan. Tokyo. Dubai. Dates. Times. Airline confirmations. The timeline suddenly looked very different. Whispers spread across the courtroom. Daniel continued. Someone used Mr. Rossi's accounts while he was thousands of miles away. The prosecutor frowned. But Daniel wasn't finished. And today, he said quietly, we will show the court exactly who that person was. Every head turned toward Isabella. For the first time, the confident smile on her face faltered. Daniel nodded toward the evidence technician. Play the recording. The room held its breath. A soft crackle came through the courtroom speakers. Then a voice filled the silence. Clear. Cold. Unmistakable. Isabella Rossi. Once Marco was gone, the recording said, the empire belongs to us. A second voice answered. Deep. Recognizable to anyone familiar with the city's underworld. Victor Marcelli. Leader of the rival crime family. And the accounts, he asked. Isabella laughed softly. Already taken care of, she replied. By the time they realize what happened, Marco will be in prison. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Reporters scrambling for their phones. The judge slammed the gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in the court. But the damage was already done. All eyes turned toward Isabella. Her face had gone pale. That recording is fake, she said suddenly, standing up. It's manipulated. Daniel calmly placed additional documents onto the screen. Courier receipts. Financial transfers. Handwritten notes. All matching the timeline of the conspiracy. The judge studied the evidence carefully. Minutes passed. The silence felt endless. Finally, the judge spoke. The charges against Marco Rossi are hereby dismissed due to overwhelming evidence of fabricated financial activity conducted without the defendant's authorization. Another wave of noise filled the courtroom. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Free. For the first time since the nightmare began. But the moment was not over. Two federal agents stepped forward. They walked directly toward Isabella. Isabella Rossi, one of them said, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and criminal collaboration with the Marcelli organization." The elegant mask she had worn for so long finally shattered. "You can't do this," she whispered. But the handcuffs clicked shut. The entire courtroom watched as the woman who had nearly destroyed an empire was led away. Her plan had collapsed. And across the room, Marco Rossi finally stood as a free man. Months passed. Winter slowly faded into spring, and with it the tension that had once wrapped itself tightly around the Rossi mansion. From the outside, the estate looked exactly the same. The towering iron gates still guarded the long private road. The fountain still shimmered beneath the Italian stone statues. The wide glass windows still reflected the morning sun. But inside, everything had changed. The mansion felt quieter now. Not the cold, empty silence that had filled the house after Marco's arrest. This silence felt different. Warmer. Peaceful. For years, the house had been a fortress built around power, secrets, and fear. Now it felt like something else. A home. And the biggest change inside those walls was Marco Rossi himself. When the scandal first ended and Marco walked free from the courthouse, many people expected him to return to the same life he had always lived. The same empire. The same ruthless focus. But prison, even a short time inside those walls, had forced Marco to confront something he had ignored for years. For decades he had believed power was the most important thing a man could build. Control. Influence. Respect. But sitting alone inside a federal detention cell had given him too much time to think. Too much time to realize what he had almost lost. Not money. Not territory. Not reputation. His children. The kitchen lights turned on just before sunrise. Marco stood at the stove wearing a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The powerful Mafia boss who once commanded entire networks of men was now staring carefully at a frying pan. Eggs. Simple scrambled eggs. And he was trying very hard not to burn them. The smell of toast filled the room. Outside the window, the morning sun began to stretch across the quiet garden. Marco checked the pan again. Still edible. Barely. Footsteps suddenly echoed down the hallway. Fast ones. Then the kitchen doors burst open. Papa. Sebastian ran in first. Matteo followed close behind, both boys still wearing their pajamas. Their hair was messy, their eyes still sleepy. Marco turned around with a serious expression. "You're late," he said sternly. The boys froze. "Late?" Sebastian asked. Marco nodded toward the stove. "The chef has been preparing breakfast for 30 minutes. Matteo leaned closer to the pan. "Papa," he said carefully. "These eggs look dangerous." Marco sighed dramatically. "Yes," he admitted. "They may be." The twins burst into laughter. Moments like this had become their new routine. Every morning. Breakfast together. Then school. And every night, Marco now sat beside their beds reading bedtime stories until their eyes slowly closed. Things he had never done before. Things he had never allowed himself time for. But now, nothing was more important. Across the hallway, Elena Morales quietly stepped into the kitchen. She carried a small basket of folded laundry. She paused in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene. The laughter. The normalcy. The life the twins had finally regained. Months earlier, Elena had believed she would eventually leave the mansion once the trial ended. Her job had been simple. She was the maid. But everything had changed the day Marco called her into his office. The office still carried the memory of the investigation. The same desk. The same shelves filled with legal files. But Marco's tone that day had been different. Not commanding. Not distant. Grateful. "You saved my family," he had told her quietly. Elena shook her head immediately. "I only did my job," she said. But Marco disagreed. "No," he replied. "Most people would have walked away." He placed a folder on the desk. "I want you to stay here." Elena looked confused. "As the housekeeper?" she asked. Marco shook his head. "Not as a maid." He opened the folder. Inside was a new contract. A new role. Children's guardian. Primary caregiver. A private room in the mansion. A higher salary. And most importantly, full trust. Elena stared at the papers. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Marco's answer came without hesitation. "Because when the world turned against me, you were the only one protecting my children." Back in the present, Elena stepped further into the kitchen. "Good morning," she said softly. Marco looked up and smiled. "Good morning." Sebastian suddenly noticed her. "Elena." Both boys jumped off their stools at the same time. They ran across the kitchen and wrapped their arms around her. "Good morning," Matteo said happily. This had become their habit. Every morning. Every afternoon after school. Every night before bed. Elena hugged them gently, brushing their messy hair back. Across the room, Marco watched quietly. For a long moment he said nothing. Because the scene in front of him made something very clear. Family was not defined by power. It was not defined by blood alone. It was defined by loyalty. And when his empire nearly collapsed, when prison walls threatened to erase everything he had built, the person who protected his children had not been a powerful ally. Not a trusted lieutenant. Not someone who carried his last name. It had been the quiet woman standing in his kitchen. Marco walked over and placed 3 plates on the table. "Breakfast is ready," he said. Sebastian climbed back onto his stool. Matteo followed. Elena hesitated. Marco gestured toward the table. "You should eat with us." Slowly, she sat down. The 4 of them shared breakfast as sunlight filled the room. Outside, the garden was calm. Inside, laughter replaced the tension that once ruled the mansion. And in that moment, Marco Rossi finally understood something he had never fully seen before. The person who saved his family was not the one who shared his name. It was the one who stood beside his children when he could not. Sometimes loyalty doesn't come from blood. Sometimes it comes from the person who stays when everyone else walks away. Sometimes it comes from the one who protects your children when the world turns against you. And sometimes that person becomes the most important part of your family.